What on earth is this? We've all bought things that ended up never getting used, left to gather dust as we wonder what we were thinking when we first purchased them. They can be all shapes and sizes: a fondue set, a Thigh Master, a pint glass with GB News printed on the side, and the most relatable of all, a 700 megawatt nuclear power plant on the banks of the Danube in Austria. I've not got one of these at home, but you might, I don't know. I'm trying to appeal to a wider audience. You join me in Lower Austria, or Niederösterreich, on a very hot day in July. I believe this video is going to be published in winter, so you'll probably look at this and be quite jealous of these conditions, but don't be, because I cycled here for over an hour and it's very, very hot and I'm very sweaty. But yes, this part of Austria is the Tulln district, which basically consists of a lot of small towns. I mean, it borders Vienna to the east, so down there it's very busy, but up at this end it's literally just like tiny villages along the banks of the Danube and like wildlife reserves. It's very, very pretty and pleasant. But I'm not here to see any of that. Instead, I'm here around 2 kilometers outside of Zwentendorf, one of those pleasant little riverside villages, to see this, AKW Zwentendorf, or Atomkraftwerk Zwentendorf, Austria's one and only nuclear power plant. Aw, isn't it hideous? Side note, I think AKW is how you'd say this in German, and Germans can correct me as they love doing, but that sounds a bit silly from an Englishman. And AKW is very wordy, and I don't want to keep saying that. So I'm going to say AKV as a compromise, and everyone can get really mad in the comments, so go for it. Now, keen-eyed viewers, and particularly those with an interest in Europe's energy sector, will probably be screaming at me, but Gabe, Austria doesn't produce any nuclear power. And that is true, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't have any nuclear power plants, which sounds weird, but let's rewind a bit. I'm not going to give you a full history of nuclear power, don't worry. So instead, we're going to start in the 1960s at the start of the European nuclear boom. There wasn't actually a pun intended when I wrote that, but now I reread it. Whoops. As geopolitical crises and abrupt decolonization movements popped up across the globe, oil and gas prices had been fluctuating wildly throughout the 1960s, causing a multitude of countries, including many in Europe, to look to nuclear power as the answer. We'll get to the issues people have with nuclear power later, but there's no getting around the fact that it offered a reliable, low-carbon, effectively infinite alternative to oil and gas. For a start, the build-out of nuclear fleets meant that multiple countries in Europe no longer had to import fossil fuels for energy, making it a more financially stable source of power. And in the 1960s, governments were looking to nuclear as a way to avoid the crazy ups and downs of oil and gas prices. France paid particular interest to the new technology, along with countries like Czechoslovakia, West Germany, and the UK, Sweden, Belgium, and others. And down here in Austria, lawmakers went, oh, we could do with some of that there, nuclear. And so in 1969, the government of Chancellor Josef Klaus of the Austrian People's Party, or OVP, gave the go-ahead for the country to begin construction on its first ever nuclear power plant, to be built by Gemeinschaftskernkraftwerk Tullnfeld GES mbH. It's a pretty catchy name. It was to be half owned by the Austrian government and half owned by a conglomeration of each Austrian federal states' individual energy companies. The federal states, by the way, were well on board with this plan. AKW Zwentendorf was expected to cost around 8 billion Austrian shillings, or around 1 billion euros in today's money, and was to produce just under 700 megawatts of power, which would have powered around 1 million households in Austria, based on average European household energy consumption in the 1970s. Bear in mind that Austria's population in 1970 was about 7 million people. So for this thing to power 1 million homes, with each home containing on average more than one person, that's a pretty sizable chunk of the country's population with their power demands met. As such, construction began in 1972, and Austria was on its way to becoming a nuclear power. In 1973, worldwide concerns over the fluctuation of oil and gas prices were vindicated when the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries, not OPEC, that's different, placed an oil embargo on nations that had supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War in the same year. This prompted a mammoth spike in oil prices worldwide and further galvanized the nuclear movement, proving that oil and gas imports were no longer a reliable method of supplying power. France went absolutely nuts, basically deciding through what was called the Mesmer Plan that almost all of its power would come from nuclear. I'm not joking when I say the plan, named for then Prime Minister Pierre Mesmer, was to build 170 nuclear power plants by the year 2000. Not individual reactors, actual power plants. For reference as to how ridiculous this is, currently around 70 71% of France's power is supplied by nuclear, but from just 18 power plants. So why they thought they needed 170 is beyond me.
Well, this is a slightly more strenuous journey than I was expecting. Somewhat understandably, Zwentendorf has been placed out in the middle of nowhere and is quite hard to find. And so I've been cycling for about an hour and 10 minutes from Tulln, and there it is. That's my first glimpse of it. And there's my little bike. And we are going to ignore the fact that I stopped earlier to do a long segment like this, where I thought I could see it, and then it turned out that it wasn't it, and it was actually a coal gas plant. To be fair, when I saw the coal and gas plant, I did think, like, that doesn't look anything like the photos I've seen online. That probably should have been a hint. So yes, we're nearly there.
Anyway, in Austria, things were a little different. While they were affected by the 1973 oil crisis, they weren't spooked in the same way as France or other pro-nuclear countries. For a start, Austria's power demand was low. It had a small population and similarly small industrial demand. But more important is that Austria had never really been all that exposed to oil and gas price fluctuations anyway, because during the 1950s and 60s, they built a lot of hydroelectric power stations, like a shit ton of them. It's an extremely mountainous country with endless bodies of water, so why not make the most of it? By the 1970s, there were hundreds of hydro plants across the country. Now there are literally thousands, and they met a huge chunk of the nation's power demand, lessening the need for oil and gas imports. As such, the general public in Austria were not really hugely fussed by nuclear. They saw it as unnecessary. I mean, what need was nuclear as a stable source of income to avoid the price fluctuations of oil and gas imports if they already had a stable energy source in the form of hydro? And I mean, isn't nuclear also dangerous? Right, here we go, this part of the video. Activism against nuclear weapons is obviously something that had been around since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of the Second World War, when the power of nuclear bombs was basically made public. Thus, the world's introduction to the power of nuclear fission had been one of death, destruction, and grave illness on an unprecedented scale. And so, despite their many benefits, by the 1960s, when massive churning nuclear reactors started popping up in people's rural communities to power their homes and keep the lights on, they were understandably skeptical. And no matter which side of the nuclear debate you fall on, you cannot claim all of their concerns were unfounded. Even many scientists actively involved in the rollout of nuclear power across Europe actually ended up joining the anti-nuclear movement, as at the time it was still seen by some as potentially dangerous, disaster-prone technology. But yes, in the mid-1970s, a group of anti-nuclear activists formed the IOAG, or the Initiative Österreichische Atomkraftwerkgegner. Oh my god, why can no German names be easy? This group, which in English would be the Initiative of Austrian Opponents of Nuclear Power Plants, was dedicated to halting Austria's march towards nuclear power, and began lobbying and protesting at various sites across the country in the mid-70s. They were concerned by the potential risk of nuclear accidents, obviously, though the major ones that we think of today, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, hadn't even happened yet. They were also worried about the disposal of nuclear waste from nuclear plants, a topic of debate that still rages today. And of course, they opposed nuclear from a cost basis. Nuclear might offer a secure supply of energy, but good grief is it expensive to construct and operate. By 1976, the government of Austria had changed hands. The fairly pro-nuclear OVP, who greenlit this project, were replaced by the extremely pro-nuclear SPOh, or Social Democratic Party, who were so pro-nuclear that not only did they continue with the construction of this, but they also greenlit 2 more nuclear power plants to be completed by 1990. In response, the IOAG organised demonstrations in Vienna, Graz, Salzburg, Innsbruck and Klagenfurt in 1976 and held 4 symposia on the topic of nuclear energy in major cities the following year to raise awareness. By this point, it already seemed way too late. The raw materials were already on their way to Zwentendorf and much of the plant had already been constructed. But in 1977, things started to change. After years of public pressure and perhaps with an eye of regaining power from the SPOh, the OVP, whose idea this power plant was, started arguing with the SPOh about the fact that not enough had been done to address safety concerns about the plant. So they started campaigning against it. By early 1978, protesters had begun calling for a referendum on the plant, which the SPOh rejected, while simultaneously shipping nuclear fuel to Zwentendorf in secret so as to avoid protests. Meanwhile, inside the plant, Siemens, yes, that Siemens who make trains and dishwashers, had finished constructing the reactor. The plant was finished and operation looked inevitable at this point. But in February 1978, the OVP officially changed its stance on Zwentendorf, opposing its construction and giving more fuel to the anti-nuclear movement's fire. Soon, the FPO, Austria's far-right party, also joined the fight against Zwentendorf, and the writing was on the wall. The SPOh, fearing that it would not receive parliamentary approval for the operation of Zwentendorf in Austria's proportional representation system, decided that the Zwentendorf question should be put to the public in a referendum. After a lengthy parliamentary back and forth, in September 1978, Austrian President Rudolf Kirchschläger announced a referendum on Zwentendorf to take place on the 5th of November the same year. Now, a big thing to remember here is that while the IOAG was very big and very loud in its opposition to nuclear power, the SPOh was banking on the belief that most of Austrian society was pro-nuclear, which for all they knew was the case. A huge exhaustive campaign by the IOAG, OVP and FPO followed in the weeks leading up to the referendum to get people to vote no on Zwentendorf, despite pretty much everyone, including the government, being extremely confident that the plant had broad electoral support. SPOh Chancellor Bruno Kreisky was so confident that he offered to resign if the people returned a vote of no. On the 5th of November 1978, the people were given their referendum and were posed the question, should the legislative resolution of the National Council of 7th of July 1978 on the peaceful use of nuclear energy in Austria, i.e. the commissioning of the Zwentendorf nuclear power plant, become law, with just two options, yes or no. And much to the SPOh's horror, by an extremely small margin of 50.5% to 49.5%, the Austrian people voted to reject the operation of AKW Zwentendorf. That 1% margin meant that from 3.2 million ballots cast, the decision on whether or not to doom this project came down to just 30,000 votes. Weirdly, while you might think that those in close proximity to the plant would be the ones to be most against it, the opposite was actually true. The people of Lower Austria, where Zwentendorf actually is, voted in favour of the plant, as did nearby Vienna and the rest of Eastern Austria. The most staunchly opposed state, with a remarkable 84% of people voting no, was Vorarlberg, all the way over here, and with minimal connection to Zwentendorf. So what happened next? Well, on the 9th of November 1978, all work at the plant was halted indefinitely. And by 1985, all of the assets within the plant, including the reactor and everything, had been fully liquidated. So in effect, it stopped being a nuclear power plant in 1985. So that means that from conception in the late 1960s to 1985 and the completion of the liquidation of the assets within the building, the entire project had cost the Austrian taxpayers the equivalent of 1 billion euros for nothing. But for a number of reasons, the plant was never torn down. For one, it was deemed incredibly costly to demolish it, and the process would have been fraught with legal issues. Furthermore, they had the foresight to believe that the plant could potentially be used for something else in the future, and so it remained standing, meaning that here on the banks of the Danube sits AKW Zwentendorf, a fully realised, completed nuclear power plant from 1978 that has never produced a single watt of energy. That's pretty weird, isn't it? Nowadays, the site offers completely free tours, but fair warning, they book out months in advance, like there are none left for the entire summer. And the military have rented it out for the day, which is why I'm not allowed inside at all. And it's why I'm stuck out here filming in 33-degree weather like a bellend. But if you think that the ramifications of the vote started and ended at Zwentendorf, oh boy, you could not be more wrong. I mean, have you even done your homework on the history of Austrian nuclear power? I don't even know why I bother with this channel. Whoa! 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 Oh. Okay, made it to the bottom. All good. Back in 1978, the SPOh took the referendum result in a slightly weird way. Rather than resigning as promised, Bruno Kreisky stayed on and in December 1978 pushed through Parliament the, Bundesverfassungsgesetz für ein atomfreies Österreich, or the Federal Constitutional Law for a Nuclear-Free Austria, banning all nuclear power from ever being built in Austria. Like, ever. Hello everybody, correction time. Right, so Kreisky didn't, it's Kreisky by the way, not Kreisky, I don't know why I got that wrong in the original recording. Kreisky did not pass this law. What happened was, Kreisky passed a law right after the rejection of Zwentendorf that prohibited the build-out of nuclear in Austria. So that part is true. But the problem is what Kreisky passed was just a regular law that could have been repealed by the next government. 20 years later, there was a federal change to Austria's whole constitution that enshrined, like, permanently Austria's inability to build any nuclear power plants. And that's what this law is. So yeah, I've mixed up the two there, but they effectively do the same thing. Just one was a regular law, one was a constitutional law. Back to the video. The reasons for Kreisky and the SPOh going nuclear in this manner, pun intended this time, are varied. Partially, it was simply to move on from an extremely divisive, close referendum and to avoid reigniting this fight over every future project. Furthermore, Austria had been keen to showcase itself as a clean and safe country, especially with its alpine tourism economy and hydropowered image. A total nuclear ban was a strong moral and environmental stance, aligning with the emerging green identity politics within the country. And so nuclear power was banned in Austria forever. Like it's still banned now. So, the legacy of this referendum. I mean, where to start? For one, Austria immediately became, and still is to this day, a completely nuclear-free country, which, you know, is a huge win for anti-nuclear types. And, you know, it's helped them keep the country safe from what they deem to be the dangers of nuclear power. And obviously, in their eyes, they were completely vindicated the following year after the referendum when the 3 Mile Island incident happened in Pennsylvania. And then, obviously, they felt extremely vindicated in 1986 when the Chernobyl accident happened.
I apologize.
Which sort of killed off any remaining lingering hopes that Austria might become a nuclear power. But the effect the vote had on Austrian society more generally was also significant. In a paper written in the 90s, political science professor David Campbell said that in retrospect, the campaign against Zwentendorf was, quote, the key event that gave decisive impetus to the development of a citizens' initiative as a new form of expression of political participation and political culture. It was also seen as the beginning of major intergenerational conflict within the country. Older, more practical voters who lived through 2 world wars and endless material destruction wanted stability and progress, and thus voted for Zwentendorf. Younger, more utopian-minded voters, swayed by the growing environmental movement and who wished for a world without any nuclear projects, be they weapons or power plants, voted against it. So we're left with this strange remnant of Austria's nuclear era, which ended before it ever began. Zwentendorf stands not just as a symbol of halted ambition, but also as a time capsule, representing the moment in 1978 in which 30,000 people changed the entire course of Austria's history overnight. Whether you see that as a triumph of public will or a disastrous misstep is up to you. Personally, I'm a proponent of nuclear, and I believe it offers unparalleled energy stability if sufficiently regulated and maintained. So to me, this was a bit of a disaster. But either way, Zwentendorf remains singular in the world. It is the only nuclear power plant in history to have been fully constructed, reactor and everything, and then without a single watt ever having been produced from it. It is, in effect, a place where the future was built and then immediately left behind. God, I tell you what, I fucking love Austria. This is like my 9th or 10th time here, and every time it's so good. It's got mountains, it's got Zweigelt, it's got good music, good food, good weather, people are friendly. It's great. Right, see you later.